Operation Torch was the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied French North Africa between 1942 and 43. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower planned an attack of three key areas to liberate the region from Nazi control. The purpose of the operation was not only to defeat the Germans, but to allow for the Americans to engage the Nazis on a limited scale. The Allies were aided by the fact that the Axis was not focused on this region, so it was not as heavily defended. The Germans were focused on Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. The Americans used this operation as combat experience for its newly drafted infantry. They just weren't ready to fight the Germans in Europe. The Allies were able to drive out the Nazis and establish a foothold in northern Africa. Operation Avalanche was the Allied invasion of Italy from the Mediterranean Sea. It took place in 1943 by the US and British forces. The first stage was the invasion and conquering of the island of Sicily, followed by a mainland invasion. After defeating the Axis powers in North Africa, the Allies set their sight on what they called the soft underbelly of Europe, the Italian peninsula. Allied leaders knew that the Italians were not as formidable as the Germans, so they planned an invasion to liberate the country from the fascists. The Allies made their way north and liberated town after town until they reached the Alps. Next up, Nazi-occupied France. The Battle of Stalingrad was a brutal military campaign between Soviet and German forces. It was one of the largest, longest, and bloodiest engagements in modern warfare. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union stalled at Leningrad and Moscow because of the bitter cold winter. Hitler changed tactics and tried to take the Soviet oil fields at Stalingrad. The Germans almost won until the winter set in. Many German troops froze or starved to death. From August 1942 through February 1943, more than 2 million troops fought in close quarters, and nearly 2 million people were killed or injured in the fighting, including tens of thousands of Russian civilians. The victory for the Soviets marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The Soviets were able to advance towards Germany. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander in Europe. His brilliant military strategy helped propel the Allies to victory against Nazi Germany. He planned many of the Allied operations in the European theater, including Operation Torch and Operation Overlord, or D-Day, the Normandy invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The Battle of Normandy, which lasted from June to August of 1944, resulted in the Allied liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany's control. Prior to D-Day, the Allies conducted a large-scale deception campaign designed to make the Germans think the main invasion target was Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France, rather than Normandy. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the battle began on June 6, 1944, also known as D-Day, when some 156,000 American, British, and Canadian forces landed on 5 beaches, along a 50-mile stretch of the heavily fortified coast of France's Normandy region. The invasion was one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history and required extensive planning. By dawn on June 6, thousands of paratroopers and glider troops were already on the ground behind enemy lines, securing bridges and exit roads. The amphibious invasions began at 6:30 a.m. The British and Canadians overcame light opposition to capture beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword, as did the Americans at Utah Beach. U.S. forces faced heavy resistance at Omaha Beach, where there were over 2,000 American casualties. However, by day's end, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had successfully stormed Normandy's beaches. According to some estimates, more than 4,000 Allied troops lost their lives in the D-Day invasion, with thousands more wounded or missing. Less than a week later, on June 11th, the beaches were fully secured and over 326,000 troops. More than 50,000 vehicles and some 100,000 tons of equipment had landed in Normandy. By late August 1944, all of northern France had been liberated, and by the following spring, the Allies had defeated the Germans. The Normandy landings have been called the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. In late 1944, during the wake of the Allied forces' successful D-Day invasion of Normandy, France, it seemed as if the Second World War was all but over. The German army launched a counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. More than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks launched Adolf Hitler's last bid to push the Allies back. Seeking to split the Allied armies, the Germans attacked the Ardennes Forest, a 75-mile stretch of the front characterized by dense woods and few roads, held by 4 inexperienced and battle-worn American divisions stationed there for rest and seasoning. General Dwight D. Eisenhower rushed reinforcements to stop the German advance. Within days, General George Patton had turned his 3rd U.S. Army to the north and was counterattacking against the German flank. American tankers and paratroopers fought off repeated attacks and refused to surrender, despite difficult odds. Within days, Patton's Third Army had relieved Bastogne, and to the north, the 2nd U.S. Armored Division stopped enemy tanks short of the Meuse River on Christmas. Through January, American troops, often wading through deep snowdrifts, attacked the sides of the shrinking Bulge until they had restored the front and set the stage for the final drive to victory. It was called by Winston Churchill the greatest American battle of the war. Hitler would never again launch an offensive in the West. In February 1945, the Big Three, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, met at Yalta, a Soviet resort town on the Black Sea. They agreed that after victory in Europe was achieved, number one, they would divide Germany into occupation zones. Number two, the Soviets would allow free elections in Eastern Europe, which they now controlled. Number three, the Soviets would enter the war with Japan. And number four, a new world peace organization would be formed at a conference in San Francisco. This would become the United Nations. In April of 1945, U.S. Army troops made a horrifying discovery. They came across the Dachau concentration complex and discovered what Allied governments already knew. The Germans were systematically killing people. This became known as the Holocaust. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he found that Germans were willing to believe him when he blamed the Jews for losing World War I and for their economic woes. This made it easy for him to pass the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship, jobs, and property. He also made them wear a bright yellow Star of David, so Nazis could identify them. Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass, occurred in November of 1938. Nazi stormtroopers attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany. 100 Jews were killed and hundreds were arrested. Hitler would later blamed the Jews for the incident. This would lead to a flood of Jews trying to immigrate to other countries. Because of immigration, fewer than 250,000 Jews remained, but the more countries Germany conquered, the more Jews they got. This led to what Hitler called his final solution. His final solution was to rid Europe of all Jews. This is also known as genocide, the systematic killing of an entire population. Hitler began implementing his final solution in German-occupied Poland. They rounded up all the Jews and moved them into ghettos. These areas were sealed off with barbed wire and were miserable places to live. Their sole purpose was to work for German industry. The next step for Jews were concentration camps. Jews were herded onto trains like cattle and sent to these labor camps. Life in the camps was a cycle of hunger, humiliation, and work that almost led to death. Unfortunately for the Jews, they were not dying fast enough. This led to the last step, mass extermination. This map shows the locations of thousands of camps created by the Nazis. Most of the extermination camps were located in Poland, where the largest population of Jews in the Reich. Work camps could be found all over Europe. This map shows the locations of concentration and extermination camps liberated by the Allies in 1944 and 1945. The most notable camps were Auschwitz, liberated by the Soviets in January of 1945, and Dachau, liberated by the United States in April of 1945. Here are some photos of camp liberations taken by Allied soldiers. Minorities played a large role in the victory in World War II. Over 1 million African Americans served in the U.S. Army, and most of them faced menial jobs and discrimination as they fought for their country. Mexican Americans also participated. 300,000 faced discrimination as they fought to free Europeans from Nazi control. The next group was Asian Americans. Over 46,000 fought, as many of their families were placed in internment camps, which we'll discuss later on. And then finally, Native American Indians. 25,000 of them fought for the government, as they used their language as a code in the Pacific. Many minorities served with distinction during World War II. Vernon J. Baker was one of a few African Americans to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions in the Italian campaign. The Navajo Code Talkers were American Indians that used the Navajo language as a code to communicate in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese were unable to figure out their language, which led to the American victory. The Tuskegee Airmen are the famed all-African American bomber escorts. They had never lost one escort during World War II. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide, fearing capture by Soviet troops. The next week, Germany surrendered. On May 8, 1945, the Allies celebrate Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. Unfortunately, FDR did not live to see this day. He had a stroke and died on April 12, 1945. His vice president, Harry S. Truman, became president. Newspapers celebrate the surrender of Germany, but warn there is still Japan to defeat.